We had the lawyers, the cash, and the influence. Karen Blackstone, freshly elected as our HOA president, leaned casually against her spotless white fence, a smug grin on her face as the demolition crew brought down my $1.8 million stone bridge. People laughed when I said I'd flood her entire $1 million farm complex in mud and water, but I didn't waste time proving them wrong. I cranked the drainage valve wide open, and the lake's water thundered through like a waterfall, swallowing her barns, storage sheds, and greenhouses whole. Costly farm machinery bobbed around like broken ships, while Karen stood in the middle of the murky swamp, screaming in disbelief. I thought that was the end until police officers showed up at my door later that night, and I knew something was very, very wrong. Comment where you're watching Anna Drama Nesta. You won't believe who they turned out to be, but let's rewind, because this whole feud with the most power-obsessed HOA president in Millbrook County started with a memory that's been stuck in my mind for weeks. I was 8 years old, walking across that bridge with my dad on a crisp October morning. He stopped halfway, placed his weathered hand on my shoulder, and said something I didn't fully understand until 37 years later. Son, this bridge isn't just a path, it's the lifeblood of this land. Without it, everything here dies. Now, at 45, standing amid the ruins of my family's legacy, I finally understood. This wasn't just any bridge. Built in 1847 by my great-great-grandfather, it was a registered historical landmark worth $1.8 million according to the county assessor, but its true worth could never be measured in dollars. That stone arch didn't just cross the creek, it contained the original water channel system that irrigated our entire property. For 5 generations, the Whitmore family had maintained both the bridge and the intricate water network that kept our orchid greenhouses alive. Those 200 rare orchid varieties weren't just plants, they were our livelihood, earning roughly $80,000 a year from collectors and botanical gardens nationwide. 18 months ago, Karen moved into the neighborhood, buying the old Henderson farm at the end of Maple Ridge Drive. Within 6 months, she charmed enough neighbors to secure the HOA presidency with promises of improving community standards and boosting property values. What she really meant was control. Her first target? My bridge. Soon, neatly typed letters on HOA stationery began appearing in my mailbox, claiming the bridge clashed with the neighborhood's look and posed a potential danger to residents. I tossed the first dozen straight in the trash. But Karen wasn't the kind to give up. 3 weeks ago, she called what she labeled an emergency home meeting. When I walked into the community center, 15 neighbors were seated in folding chairs, eyes down. Karen stood at a makeshift podium, clipboard in hand like a weapon, delivering a full slideshow on alleged safety hazards. She even had 3 neighbors sign sworn statements saying they'd seen cracks in the bridge's foundation. The vote? 15-3. Only Mrs. Patterson, the Johnsons from Oak Street, and I opposed her new emergency regulation, the immediate removal of non-conforming structures that could endanger the community. The next morning, a legal notice landed in my mailbox. Demolish the bridge within 7 days or face $500 daily fines. I called my attorney, Jim Morrison, the same one who handled my father's estate. He researched for 2 days, then gave me the mixed verdict. Yes, Marcus, it's protected as a historical landmark, but state HOA laws get messy when safety concerns are involved. They can't outright force you to remove it, but they can bury you in fines and legal battles that might cost more than the bridge itself. I told Jim I needed time to think, but Karen wasn't going to give me any. Her knockout punch came while I was in town buying orchid fertilizer. My 16-year-old son, Tyler, called in a panic. Dad, you've got to come home now. There's a bulldozer here. They say they have an emergency demolition order. I sped home doing 70 in a 45, but I was already too late. Karen had called Channel 7 News. Reporter Susan Mills was there, microphone in hand, filming Karen as she posed as the concerned leader protecting the neighborhood from a dangerous structure. The bulldozer had emergency demolition services printed on the side, and the operator looked official enough to convince anyone not paying close attention. Karen stood there in her immaculate white blazer, clipboard in hand, telling the camera, as HOA president, I have a responsibility to protect public safety above sentiment. Mr. Whitmore has had plenty of time to address the structural concerns that we simply cannot wait for tragedy. From my truck, I watched as 150 years of family history was reduced to rubble. Every stone that fell felt like another piece of my father being ripped away. This wasn't sloppy work, as someone had planned this down to the last detail, timed it for when I'd be gone, and made sure the media would spin the story their way. Tyler stood on the porch, tears in his eyes, filming the destruction for the school project he'd been working in, one that was supposed to feature the bridge as its crown jewel. By the time the last stone fell, neighbors had gathered. Some looked genuinely worried, others, deeply uncomfortable. Karen's tactics had worked, and no one dared challenge the HOA president, who had just given the entire neighborhood a masterclass in raw authority. She wrapped up with one last interview, expressing her deep regret over the situation, all while stressing her unwavering dedication to community safety and neighborhood standards. Then, like she'd just completed a routine inspection rather than erasing a century and a half of history, she tucked her clipboard under her arm, slid into her white BMW SUV, and drove off without a backward glance. The real damage revealed itself over the next few days. Without the bridge's water channel system, my orchid greenhouse started to suffer. These weren't grocery store flowers, if they were rare, delicate specimens, each worth up to $500. Dependent on exact humidity and precise watering schedules to survive. By Thursday, a dozen had already died. By the weekend, the number had climbed to 47. Tyler worked tirelessly, trying to cobble together a makeshift irrigation system with hoses and sprinklers. But orchids aren't forgiving plants. They don't handle sudden environmental shifts well. That Sunday evening, we sat together on the porch, staring at the rubble where the bridge had stood. My son, mature beyond his years, placed a hand on my shoulder, mirroring a gesture my father had once given me. "Dad, we can't let her get away with this. Grandpa built something beautiful, and she tore it down just because she could." I wanted to tell him that life isn't always fair, that sometimes bullies win and decent people have to pick up the pieces, but the words never came. Instead, I found myself thinking of my father's warning about protecting this land. That's when I began to wonder if Karen had made one critical misstep in her rush to show off her power. That night, I walked out to the old tool shed where Dad kept his engineering plans and property records. In the bottom drawer, buried under decades of tax documents and maintenance logs, I found the original hydraulic survey map he'd commissioned when he modernized the water system. The yellowed paper crackled as I spread it out across the kitchen table. My eyes traced the faded lines, and then it hit me. Karen's pride and joy, her Emerald Acres organic farm complex, sat directly on what used to be a seasonal floodplain, and she had no idea that my father had installed a secondary drainage valve capable of diverting the entire lake's overflow straight into the low-lying area. I thought of my father's words, of Tyler's tears, and of the empty space where our bridge once stood. That night, my mind was made up. If Karen Blackstone wanted a power struggle, she'd picked the wrong family. She was about to learn that the quiet man who knows every inch of this land can be far more dangerous than a newcomer with lawyers and a clipboard. The next morning, I treated my father's map like a battle plan. Coffee cooled untouched beside me as I studied the hand-drawn notations marking every water channel, flood zone, and drainage point. My pulse quickened. Karen's farm wasn't just in a low spot, it was right in the middle of what my father had labeled, in his meticulous handwriting, seasonal wetlands. Avoid permanent structures. I grabbed my binoculars and hiked up the ridge behind our property. From there, I had a perfect vantage point. Through the lenses, Karen's investment gleamed in the sunlight of 4 massive greenhouses with flawless glass panels, a state-of-the-art irrigation system, and rows of meticulously spaced David Austin roses, each worth hundreds. A bright red barn housed gleaming farm machinery, with at least 2 tractors visible inside. But then I spotted something even more interesting: a Karen giving a tour. A group of 5 people in business attire followed her, jotting notes and snapping photos as she pointed out her greenhouses and gardens. I adjusted the focus and caught sight of a scale model set up on a folding table. Karen's animated gestures and sweeping arm motions toward the open fields made it obvious that this wasn't just a vanity project. She was pitching a major business expansion. Curiosity got the better of me, I drove past her gate slowly as she was so engrossed in selling her vision to the investors that she didn't even notice. I parked at the public boat launch a quarter-mile away and crept back along the tree line. What I heard through the open barn doors made everything fall into place. A broken bar, gentlemen. Emerald Acres is more than a farm, it's the first truly sustainable agritourism destination in Millbrook County, Karen declared, her voice carrying the same commanding tone she'd used at the home meeting. We're not just producing organic vegetables and heritage roses, we're creating an experience. Phase 2 will feature a boutique bed and breakfast, a farm-to-table restaurant, and hands-on workshops for city families who want to reconnect with nature. One of the men in the group, tall with silver hair, cut in, Miss Blackstone, your numbers are impressive, but what about water rights and drainage? This property seems a broken bar, quite low compared to the surrounding land. Karen laughed, a short, dismissive sound that told me everything. That's not an issue. Our irrigation system is engineered to work with the natural water table. The previous owners never had any flooding problems. The soil here drains beautifully, and its organic content is ideal. I almost burst out laughing right there in the tree line. She had no clue that her perfect land was a natural flood zone. Once the investors drove off in their sleek black sedans, I stayed put for another hour, studying the layout of her operation. Her main greenhouse complex sat at the very lowest point of the property, probably chosen for the rich, level soil. The costly irrigation controls were housed in a small concrete building that sat even lower, precisely where my father's survey had marked the deepest section of the seasonal wetlands. It was obvious she'd sunk serious money into permanent structures without bothering to check historical flood records. Then I made my biggest find yet. Hidden behind an overgrowth of blackberry vines and sumac was the old emergency drainage valve from my father's map. From the outside, it looked like nothing but a mossy concrete block. 30 years of weeds and debris later, I cleared it away and there it was, rusty, but functional, connected to a 6-inch pipe leading straight from the lake's overflow system down into the valley, a broken bar where Karen had built her empire. I remember Dad showing it to me during a rainy spring in high school when the lake had swelled past its banks. Son, that valve is for absolute emergencies only, he'd said while we inspected the regular channels. Open it, and the water rushes to the valley like a dam breaking. Your great-grandfather put it in during the flood of 1932. Better to drown in empty pasture than lose the house and barn. But that pasture wasn't empty anymore. Standing there with my hand on the cold metal wheel, I felt something shift. This wasn't about petty revenge, it was about righting a wrong. Karen had destroyed an irreplaceable piece of my family's heritage, cost me thousands in damaged orchids, and done it all with a smug grin and a false pretense of community safety. She'd raised investor money on a glossy fantasy of sustainable farming without learning the first thing about the land she was using. The cautious, law-abiding voice in my head, one that sounded a lot like my father, urged me to take the high road, sue her, fight her in court, let the legal system deliver justice. But another voice, one belonging to the younger man who once sprinted across that stone bridge every summer, whispered that some bullies only understand force. Karen had staged my humiliation in front of the news cameras, making sure the entire neighborhood knew who held the power. Maybe it was time she learned that power can flow both ways. That afternoon, I dug through Dad's old engineering books, running numbers on flood patterns and water flow rates. The calculations were straightforward: open the valve slowly, and I could control the stream, directing it exactly where I wanted. Her farm sat nearly 6 feet lower than the valve outlet, and Dad's system was designed for flash flood conditions capable of moving thousands of gallons per minute. Her cutting-edge irrigation and computer-controlled sprinklers didn't stand a chance against that kind of volume. At dinner, Tyler caught me staring at the old map. "Dad, what's so fascinating about water pipes and elevation marks?" I looked at my son, the same kid who'd cried watching our bridge crumble, who had spent days trying to save our orchids with nothing more than a garden hose. "Tyler, remember when you said we couldn't let Karen get away with what she did?" He nodded, eyes steady. "Well, sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to speak their language. She thinks money, lawyers, and HOA rules make her untouchable. But she forgot to learn the land she's building on, and that might be the most costly mistake she'll ever make. The next morning would decide everything. I could take the high road, file a lawsuit, and maybe, years from now, win compensation for my loss or a broken bar. I could either take the high road, or I could open that valve and let Karen Blackstone learn the same lesson her investors eventually would. You don't build a lasting empire on land you don't understand. What I didn't yet know was just how far she'd go to protect her investment, or how dangerous she could become when her carefully crafted world was under threat. The forecast for Tuesday night promised heavy thunderstorms starting after midnight, ideal cover for what I had in mind. At 2 in the morning, with the rain pounding hard enough to hide any sound, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to my father's old emergency valve. My hands trembled as I gripped the rusted wheel, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of what I was about to set in motion. I told myself I'd just nudge it open, let it trickle flow, just enough to give Karen a taste of why you respect other people's property. But one full turn of that wheel unleashed 30 years of pent-up force. What roared out wasn't a polite stream, it was a monster. The outlet spewed a torrent 3 feet wide, tearing downhill toward Karen's farm like a liquid freight train. The noise was deafening, a mix between a waterfall and a runaway locomotive. My father hadn't been exaggerating. This system was built for true emergencies, designed to move an ocean's worth of water in minutes. By the time I tried to close it again, the pressure had locked the mechanism solid. This wasn't going to be the controlled demonstration I'd imagined. This was going to be biblical. The rain kept hammering down, feeding the chaos, as decades of engineering expertise carried out its grim task. Karen's farm was about to see a 100-year flood delivered on a random Tuesday before dawn. When the sun rose, I stood on my porch with a coffee, binoculars in hand. The sight was surreal. Where Emerald Acres had been the day before, a 3-acre lake now shimmered in the morning light. Debris floated like a graveyard of lost ships. Her $180,000 John Deere tractor sat sideways in 4 feet of muddy water, a stranded green island in a brown sea. The automated irrigation system she'd flaunted to her investors was gone. Only the roof of the control shed poked above the waterline. Her 4 pristine greenhouses were shattered, glass blown out and steel frames warped into twisted skeletons. 200 David Austin Rosassa, each worth hundreds, were buried under mud and silt. The climate control systems, the computer-run sprinklers, the imported organic soil, all of it had become part of a soggy wasteland stretching from her barn to the property line. Around 7, her white BMW flew down the driveway. She stepped out in designer rain boots, staring at the ruin in stunned disbelief. She pulled out her phone, recording the devastation, her lips moving quickly as she panned across what was left of her kingdom. Even from my vantage point, I could read her posture, pure panic. Within an hour, she'd called an emergency home meeting. Nobody wanted to be there. I drove past the community center and saw 3 cars in the lot, one of them hers. Through the window, I spotted her pacing in front of an empty room, still in those absurd boots, waving her phone like she was scolding an invisible audience. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. A week ago, she'd commanded rooms full of intimidated neighbors. Now she was talking to herself in an echoing building. The best part came when a few curious residents wandered in. Tyler happened to ride by on his bike and overheard through the open windows. Karen was adamant this was sabotage. This wasn't natural flooding. She kept repeating, "Someone did this to me. This much water doesn't come from a regular rainstorm." She wasn't wrong, but she had no evidence, and no clue how the water had found its way there. As far as anyone else knew, it was just a freak storm hitting a low-lying property. By afternoon, she'd hired a private investigator, Rick Solomon, a former detective who showed up in a black Chevy Suburban and wore sunglasses indoors like he was auditioning for his own crime drama. I watched him from the ridge as he stepped out, scanning the property like he was already smelling blood in the water. Rick Solomon spent the better part of 2 hours wading through the wreckage with Karen, snapping photos, taking measurements, tracing water lines along the barn walls, and studying the way debris had settled. Eventually, he shook his head and said something that made her shoulders sag. Even to a seasoned investigator, the scene read as natural flood damage. Extreme, yes, but still the work of weather, not sabotage. Her investors didn't share that polite detachment. The silver-haired man who had grilled her about drainage during her presentation the day before took one look at the disaster zone and immediately started dialing lawyers, insurers, maybe both. By the time the sun dropped behind the hills, all 5 potential backers had left in their town cars, abandoning Karen to stand alone in her expensive rain boots at the edge of what had been her pride and joy. That night, Tyler and I made popcorn and took seats on the back porch to watch her frantic recovery efforts. She'd hired a crew with pumps and a tow truck to drain the new lake and haul out what was salvageable, but 3 feet of muck had settled over everything, making the job nearly impossible. Her gleaming $180,000 John Deere tractor was now a loss, buried up to its cab in thick, wet clay that would take weeks to dig out. "Dad, that's the most expensive swamp I've ever seen," Tyler said, nodding toward the floodlights where the crew worked. "Do you think she'll figure out what happened?" I thought of Dad's engineering, of 30 years of stored water finally set free, of the quiet justice that comes when the universe decides someone needs a lesson. "Son," I said, "sometimes when you build your house on someone else's foundation, you find out it's not as solid as you thought." Karen had learned that you can't bulldoze your way through other people's lives without the ground pushing back. But I didn't yet understand that Karen Blackstone wasn't the type to take a loss quietly. The drowned farm was just her opening move. What came next would be louder phone calls, accusations, and the kind of escalation that turns neighbor disputes into police matters. I'd won the first round, but Karen was already plotting the next. 3 days after her farm became an expensive marsh, I assumed the worst had passed. I was wrong. At exactly 11:30 p.m. on Friday, 3 sharp knocks rattled my front door. Tyler and I had been enjoying a quiet evening with a baseball game when the sound broke in. Peeking through the peephole, I saw 3 men in police uniforms standing under the porch light, faces set in that official seriousness that can make your stomach drop even when you know you've done nothing wrong. "Mr. Whitmore, we're here about reports of property damage and need to ask you a few questions," the tallest one said as I opened the door. Something felt off immediately, maybe their stance, maybe something deeper and more instinctual. My time volunteering with the county's emergency services had taught me the habits of real officers, and these men didn't fit the pattern. The first thing I spotted was their footwear. They wore standard black police boots, but the soles were caked with the same reddish clay that coated Karen's property after the flood. Real Millbrook County officers patrol paved streets, not mud-filled fields. Then there was their gear. Every local officer has worn a body camera for years of policia, but these 3 had none. Their radios hissed with static, the wrong kind, not the crisp digital chatter I was used to hearing. What clinched my suspicion was their sidearms. County officers carry Glock 22 pistols with serial numbers clearly stamped into the metal. These guns looked right at first glance, but under the porch light I could see smooth, blank patches where those numbers should have been, like someone had filed them down or bought props from a movie supplier. "We understand there's been flooding in the area," the second man said, his voice carrying a faint southern drawl that didn't belong in our midwestern town. "We'd like you to come with us to answer some questions about Tuesday night." When I asked for a closer look at their badges, the tall one's expression tightened in a way no real officer would let happen. "Sir, we're conducting an investigation," he said. "We'd appreciate your cooperation, but we can do this the hard way if necessary." That sealed-eyed these weren't cops. Real Millbrook officers de-escalate, they don't threaten, and they certainly don't show up at 11:30 at night about property damage without paperwork or a warrant. They were here fishing, and they weren't even good at it. I told them I needed to grab my jacket and I told them I'd grab my jacket and be right out. The second I stepped inside, I pulled out my phone and fired off a text to Detective Ray Sullivan, my dad's old friend of 30 years. "Ray, do you have units at my house right now? 3 officers here want to take me in for questioning about property damage." His reply came in under a minute. "Negative. No units dispatched to your address. Do not go anywhere with them. Real backup on the way." While I was inside, Tyler had been upstairs with a perfect view of the porch, doing what teenagers do best, of filming everything. Later, when we reviewed his footage, we caught one of the officers answering his phone and saying, "Karen, We got him. He'll sign the settlement by midnight or we're moving to phase 2. That one sentence tied the whole thing together and handed us the evidence we'd need to bury Karen Blackstone's little empire. I stepped back outside and told the trio I'd be happy to cooperate but wanted my lawyer present. That's when the tall one's patience snapped. "Mr. Whitmore, this is a simple matter. We just need you to acknowledge you're responsible for the flooding damage to Ms. Blackstone's property and work out a reasonable settlement. No need for lawyers." There it was, not an investigation, just an intimidation shakedown to get me to admit guilt and cut Karen a check. They weren't cops at all, just hired muscle in borrowed uniforms, probably from the same private security team I'd seen patrolling her property during those investor visits. The realization that she was willing to commit felonies to dodge responsibility told me exactly how far she'd go. Then one of them slipped. Adjusting his jacket, his shirt collar shifted, revealing the edge of a dark blue polo with a company logo, Secure Max Private Security. I knew the name instantly. I'd seen their trucks parked outside her barn. She hadn't just sent her security team after me, she'd dressed them as police officers and sent them to my door at night. That's when the real sirens cut through the neighborhood. Their faces shifted from smug confidence to pure panic as Detective Sullivan's cruiser rolled into my driveway, lights blazing. Karen had just escalated a civil dispute into a criminal case. Impersonating an officer is a federal offense, and even the best attorneys can't make it vanish easily. The next morning, while Sullivan processed the 3 arrests, Tyler made a discovery that pushed our property dispute into far darker territory. He'd been testing some new audio gear for a school journalism project and reviewing recordings from the past week. Somewhere in that pile was a file that made him go pale. "Dad, you need to hear this right now," he said, barreling into the kitchen with his laptop and headphones. "I accidentally recorded Karen talking about chemicals and it's really bad." The clip was from Wednesday morning, 2 days after the flood. Karen had been on her property, thinking she was alone, but Tyler's microphone had caught her voice carrying across the water from 200 yards away. No, the algicide shipment needs to be disposed of immediately. 20 containers, industrial strength. I've been using it for 6 months to keep the water crystal clear for the investors. If anyone finds out I've been dumping that stuff into the community water system, I'm finished. I stared at my son, trying to process it. Algicide meant for swimming pools and ornamental ponds. It kills algae, yes, but also fish, plants, and can harm people if it enters drinking water. Karen hadn't just been cutting corners, she'd been poisoning the neighborhood's water supply for half a year, all to keep her property photo ready for investors. The same sparkling creek water that fed into the county reservoir had been dosed with industrial chemicals. Tyler pulled up another file. "Dad, remember when all the fish in Miller's Creek started dying back in February, and Mrs. Patterson's garden just withered for no reason? I think we just figured out why." He was right. The fish kills, the dying gardens, the unexplained environmental problems over the last 6 months. The things we'd all chalked up to bad weather suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. The environmental problems had been right in front of us: dead fish lining the creek banks, wilted gardens, even a few neighborhood pets falling sick after drinking from outdoor water sources. I called Detective Sullivan immediately and told him what Tyler had uncovered. His tone shifted to all business. "Marcus, if this is true, we're not dealing with a neighborhood spat anymore. This is federal territory. If she's been dumping chemicals into the water supply, the EPA will need to get involved fast. This could impact hundreds of families." Within the hour, Ray was at our kitchen table with a digital recorder, logging Tyler's audio evidence and taking detailed notes on the timeline of environmental issues in the area. What made the situation even more damning was the paper trail I'd been keeping. For 3 years, I'd tracked our water bills as part of managing the orchid greenhouse. When I pulled the records, the pattern was undeniable. Starting in November, the exact month Karen began her water beautification efforts, chlorine levels in our municipal supply had shot up by 300%. The water department had sent notices claiming it was a seasonal adjustment. Now it was clear. The treatment plant had detected Karen's chemical runoff and had been quietly adding chlorine to neutralize it without knowing the real cause. Tyler and I spent the rest of the morning gathering evidence. We found 20 empty algaecide containers hidden behind her flooded barn, probably in the hope the floodwaters would wash them away. Receipts from an industrial supplier showed monthly purchases of pond chemicals in quantities no legitimate organic farm would need. And the smoking gun? Water samples Tyler had collected 3 weeks before the flood for a school science project are still sealed and labeled in our Phrygia, proof the contamination predated the flooding. By noon, Ray had contacted the EPA. By mid-afternoon, 2 agents in dark suits were wading through Karen's property with test kits and evidence bags. Agent Sarah Martinez explained that cases like this were more common than people realized, especially in rural areas where chemical dumping often went unnoticed. Agricultural contamination can impact entire watersheds, she said while photographing the algaecide containers. If Miss Blackstone has been doing this for 6 months, we're talking felony charges and enormous cleanup costs. The timing couldn't have been worse for Karen. While she was still reeling from the criminal impersonation charges, the EPA was now combing her land for evidence of federal environmental crime charges that could mean prison time. Through binoculars, I watched them bag each chemical container, collect water from multiple points, and document the crude system she'd rigged to release algaecide directly into the creek feeding our community's water supply. The most infuriating part? She knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't ignorance or carelessness, it was calculated. She was willing to poison an entire community to make her organic farm streams look pristine for glossy investor photos. Tyler had been quiet most of the afternoon, watching the agents pack their vehicles. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, do you think she realizes the fake cops thing is the least of her worries now?" I looked at my 16-year-old son, the same kid who had stumbled onto a federal case with a school projector, and felt a wave of pride. "Son, I think Karen's about to learn that when you build your empire on someone else's foundation, sometimes it all comes down at once." But I didn't know then that she still had one last desperate move to make. The woman who destroyed my bridge, poisoned our water, and tried to intimidate us with fake officers wasn't finished. Monday morning brought the storm, the media storm. Karen had spent the weekend with a crisis PR firm, and by 7 a.m., my phone was lighting up with alerts from a coordinated social media barrage. Slick, aggressive, and clearly desperate. Her new tactic wasn't just to deny everything, it was to twist the story entirely, turning herself from the villain into the victim. Karen's counterattack was as calculated as it was dishonest. Her crisis PR firm rolled out a campaign called Save Our Community, painting her as the innocent target of so-called domestic ecoterrorism at the hands of an unstable neighbor. By Monday morning, Facebook and Twitter were flooded with posts from supposed concerned Millbrook residents claiming they'd always suspected I was dangerous and unbalanced. A sleek, professionally produced podcast titled The Truth About Marcus Whitmore had dropped over the weekend, featuring shadowy anonymous voices insisting I'd been obsessed with revenge ever since Karen became HOA president. The host, describing herself as a local environmental expert, spent nearly an hour explaining how my deliberate flooding had stirred up decades-old buried toxins, supposedly causing the contamination. But Karen's biggest play was a video that hit every platform at the same time Monday morning. It showed me standing near the old drainage valve the day after the flood, apparently talking to myself about teaching her a lesson and making sure she pays for what she did. The editing was clever, cutting out Tyler's voice and responses so it looked like I was ranting in a one-sided, unhinged monologue. The footage had been shot from her property with a telephoto lens, captioned, "Local man admits to destroying neighbor's organic farm in revenge plot." This wasn't a random angry neighbor with a smartphone. This was a high-budget smear operation. The podcast even featured expert commentary from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who explained in scientific detail how artificial flooding could release long-hidden contaminants. Social media posts came with slick maps and contamination diagrams designed to look official, convincing anyone who didn't read the tiny disclaimers. Tyler was the first to grasp how dangerous this was when classmates started asking if his dad was an ecoterrorist. By lunchtime, a school guidance counselor had pulled him aside to ask if there were safety concerns at home. I'd already gotten 3 calls from neighbors asking if any of it was true. and one longtime acquaintance crossed the street rather than walk past me at the mailbox. Karen's plan was working at turning me from a victim of HOA abuse into a social outcast. That's when Maggie Chen, our sharp-minded retired judge neighbor, stepped in. She'd been watching this disaster unfold from her front porch and knew exactly how fast lies could cement themselves in a small town. At 3 p.m. Monday, she knocked on my door, legal pad in hand, wearing the same look that had once made defense attorneys quake in her courtroom. "Marcus," she said, "I've been digging into Karen's history. The neighborhood needs to know what I found." What she'd uncovered would have made a professional investigator proud. Using her access to legal databases, Maggie had traced Karen's real PASA, a sealed 2014 case in Orange County, California, where she'd been convicted of environmental fraud. The scheme was eerily similar, contaminating a water source to boost property appeal. She'd been fined $200,000, sentenced to 3 years probation, and had changed her name from Karen Blackstone Morrison to simply Karen Blackstone before moving across the country. With Maggie's evidence, we knew what we had to do. That very afternoon, Tyler, Maggie, and I set up a press conference by the ruins of the destroyed bridge. We invited the Channel 7 reporter who'd covered the demolition, and luckily EPA agent Martinez had just completed preliminary water tests and was prepared to speak publicly. The difference between our press event and Karen's media assault was night and day. Ours was raw, straightforward, and backed by proof. Tyler played his audio recording of Karen openly admitting to dumping chemicals. I showed the EPA's contamination reports. Maggie revealed the details of her prior conviction. But the real turning point came when reporter Susan Mills asked about the environmental risk. Agent Martinez stepped forward, holding a folder of test results. "Our preliminary findings show contamination levels 400% above EPA safety limits," she said firmly. "This is a direct and serious threat to public health." As we began wrapping up, I spotted Karen herself standing at the edge of the property. She'd been watching from her car, likely plotting some sort of dramatic entrance. The press conference was nearly over when the interruption happened. Karen stepped into view, clearly intending to make some sort of dramatic entrance, but before she could stage her moment, reporter Susan Mills spotted her and called out for a comment. Karen's temper got the best of her. Those chemicals were FDA approved for agricultural use. She shouted. It was an unforced error of epic proportions, as she had just publicly admitted to using substances that are explicitly banned anywhere near drinking water. In one outburst, she confirmed exactly what the EPA investigation had been trying to prove. From that moment, her entire smear campaign unraveled. The flood of social media posts vanished overnight. The anonymous sources stopped talking. The polished podcast disappeared from every streaming platform. Facebook groups that had once been buzzing with her propaganda went silent. Neighbors who had been avoiding me for days began showing up with apologies and even offers to help rebuild the bridge. The same people she tried to turn against me were now uniting in my defense. Karen's empire of lies had collapsed, and she was about to find out that federal judges don't take kindly to manipulative PR stunts. As I watched her white BMW roll away down Maple Ridge Drive, I knew this was bigger than revenge. It was about proving that ordinary people can stop bullies, even those with deep pockets, slick lawyers, and media consultants. Karen had underestimated the strength of a community that chooses to stand together. And now she was going to face the full weight of the law for every deceit and every crime she'd committed in her attempt to destroy my family's name. 3 weeks later, I stood on the rubble of our old bridge as federal marshals led Karen Blackstone out of the Millbrook County Courthouse in handcuffs. She had just been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, fined $150,000 for environmental violations, and given an extra 6 months for staging the fake police incident. Watching the marshal's vehicle disappear down Main Street, I felt something I hadn't felt in months apiece. The change in our neighborhood was immediate. In an emergency HOA vote that lasted all of 4 minutes, Maggie Chen was unanimously elected president. Her first order of business: recognize my bridge as a protected historic landmark and create a fund for its reconstruction. The EPA concluded its investigation shortly afterward, announcing a $2 million cleanup plan for our water supply, most of it paid for through the seizure of Karen's assets. Tyler, meanwhile, had become a bit of a local celebrity. The county newspaper ran a front-page story about the teenager who broke the environmental crime case. CNN interviewed him about citizen journalism and the role young people can play in holding adults accountable. His school journalism teacher nominated him for a state award, and 3 universities reached out with scholarship offers for his investigative work. Watching him handle interviews with poise and intelligence made me prouder than any professional accomplishment I'd ever achieved. Financially, the outcome exceeded my expectations. Between insurance payouts, EPA victim compensation, and a successful civil judgment, I received $500,000 to rebuild the bridge according to its original 1847 design. The Historical Society prioritized the project, even providing access to the original blueprints. Work would begin in the spring, with updated engineering to handle modern water flow but the same historic look. Karen's downfall continued long after her sentencing. Her Emerald Acres property was seized by the government and converted into a public wetland preserve. Surviving farm equipment was auctioned to cover legal costs. Her once pristine MWA symbol of her statue was repossessed. Secure Max Private Security lost its operating license after the fake police scandal, and 3 employees ended up in jail for impersonating officers. Her final embarrassment came during an asset forfeiture hearing when she attempted to live-stream a farewell speech from the courthouse steps. Mid-broadcast, she blurted out, "I did what I had to do to protect my investment, including hiring those security consultants to pressure my neighbor." Federal prosecutors immediately confiscated her phone, added obstruction of justice to her charges, and tacked on another 3 months to her sentence. That evening, Tyler and I sat at the kitchen table sketching plans for the memorial that would be part of the new bridge. We settled on a bronze plaque that would read, "In memory of Daniel Whitmore, a protector of these waters." Beneath it, we'd place a sealed time capsule containing the full account of Karen's crimes and the way our community fought back. Inside would be Tyler's original audio recordings, the EPA's water test results, court transcripts, and newspaper clippings, everything future generations would need to understand that ordinary citizens can stand up to corruption and environmental abuse. As we worked, I checked the mailbox and found a plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside was an old black and white photograph of my father standing proudly on our bridge beside a man I didn't recognize. Both were pointing toward surveying equipment set up in the distance. On the back, in precise handwriting, someone had written, "Marcus, your father protected more than just one bridge. There are 3 other locations in the county where guardians like him are needed now. The old drainage systems connect more than you realize, and some people would exploit them the same way Karen did. We need to talk." A friend. I brought the photograph inside, and Tyler and I spent the evening studying it under a magnifying glass, tracing every detail in search of clues. Whoever this friend was, they were telling me my father had been part of something much bigger, something that reached beyond our land. Looking at the photo, then at this young man who had helped uncover federal crimes armed with nothing more than curiosity and determination, I understood that the responsibility for protecting our waters might now be passing to us. Karen Blackstone had proven that power without accountability is dangerous, but she had also proven something far more important. When truth is on their side, ordinary people can stand against tyranny, whether it's in HOA president, a corporation, or a carefully polished PR campaign. And so our story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If you've ever felt powerless against someone with money, lawyers, and influence, you're not alone. Stand together, speak up, defend what matters, because sometimes, the smallest voices can protect the largest foundations.